Big Jake Morrison had been driving 18-wheelers across America's highways for 27 years, but nothing had prepared him for the cargo he would pick up on Interstate 80 that freezing February night. The dispatch call came in at 11:45 p.m. while Jake was refueling at a truck stop outside Omaha. "Emergency pickup," they said. "Special cargo from a private client." The pay was triple his usual rate, but there was a catch: he had to drive through the night without stopping, no matter what he saw or heard. "What kind of cargo?" Jake asked the dispatcher, but the line went dead. The pickup location was a rest area 30 miles down a desolate stretch of highway. Jake pulled his rig into the empty parking lot, the diesel engine rumbling in the bitter cold. A black sedan waited near the loading dock, its windows tinted so dark they seemed to absorb light. A man in an expensive suit emerged from the sedan. He was tall, pale, and moved with an unnatural grace that made Jake's skin crawl. His eyes were the color of winter ice, and when he smiled, Jake noticed his teeth were too sharp, too white. "Mr. Morrison," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent Jake couldn't place. "Thank you for taking this assignment on such short notice." "What am I hauling?" Jake asked, watching as two figures in coveralls began loading wooden crates into his trailer. "Specimens," the man replied. "Very delicate specimens that require immediate transport to our facility in Colorado." Jake peered into the trailer and saw dozens of wooden crates, each marked with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the overhead lights. The crates were bound with thick chains and secured with multiple padlocks. A strange, sweet smell emanated from them, like flowers mixed with decay. "What kind of specimens?" Jake pressed. The man's smile widened. "The kind that are better left undisturbed, Mr. Morrison. I trust you'll follow the instructions precisely. No stops, no inspections, no questions. You'll be paid handsomely for your discretion." Jake signed the paperwork, pocketed the advance payment, and watched the sedan disappear into the night. As he pulled back onto the highway, he tried to ignore the feeling that something was very wrong about this run. The first hour passed without incident. Jake drove through the Nebraska flatlands, his CB radio crackling with the chatter of other night drivers. The trailer felt heavier than it should have, and the truck's handling was sluggish, as if the cargo was shifting constantly. At 1:30 a.m., Jake heard the first sound. It was soft at first, like scratching inside the trailer walls. Jake dismissed it as cargo settling, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. It became a rhythmic scraping, as if something was trying to claw its way out. Jake pulled over at a way station to investigate. The building was dark, abandoned for the night. He walked around to the back of his trailer, flashlight in hand, and immediately wished he hadn't. 3 of the wooden crates had been torn open from the inside. The chains lay scattered on the trailer floor, and the padlocks had been shredded as if they were made of paper. Dark stains covered the walls, and the sweet smell was now overwhelming. But the crates weren't empty. They were filled with earth, black, rich soil that seemed to pulse with its own life. And embedded in the soil were pale, root-like tendrils that writhed and twisted when Jake's flashlight beam hit them. "What the hell?" Jake whispered, backing away from the trailer. The tendrils suddenly shot out toward him, moving with impossible speed. Jake stumbled backward, slamming the trailer doors shut. He could hear them hitting the metal with wet, slapping sounds. Jake ran back to his cab and grabbed his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Jake on eastbound 80. I need help out here. Something's wrong with my cargo." Static filled the airwaves. Jake tried different channels, but every frequency was dead. Even his cell phone showed no signal, though he was in an area with good coverage. The scratching sounds from the trailer were getting louder. Jake could feel the entire rig shaking as whatever was inside tried to break free. He had no choice but to keep driving and hope he could reach the delivery point before things got worse. But they got much worse. At 2:45 a.m., Jake's headlights illuminated something that made his blood freeze. A figure stood in the middle of the highway, directly in his path. It was tall, impossibly thin, and covered in what looked like bark or dried skin. Its arms were too long, ending in gnarled fingers that dragged along the asphalt. Jake swerved, his trailer jackknifing as he fought to avoid the creature. The truck skidded across the median, coming to rest in a ditch. Steam rose from the radiator, and Jake could hear the hiss of escaping air from the brakes. The figure approached his cab, moving with that same unnatural grace as the man in the suit. Up close, Jake could see that its face was a mass of writhing roots and pale fungi. Where its eyes should have been, there were dark hollows that seemed to extend infinitely inward. "Driver," it said, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "You carry our children. You must complete the journey. What are you?" Jake gasped, his hand fumbling for the door handle. "We are the harvest," the creature replied. "We have been waiting so long to return to the fertile lands of the West. Your cargo is precious to us." The trailer doors burst open behind Jake. He turned to see dozens of the pale tendrils spilling out onto the highway, writhing and searching. They moved across the asphalt like living cables, and where they touched, the road surface began to crack and crumble. "The specimens are awakening," the creature observed. "Soon, they will take root in the new soil. Soon, the harvest will begin." Jake tried to start the engine, but it only wheezed and died. The tendrils were surrounding the truck now, some of them thick as tree trunks, others thin as wire. They began to wrap around the cab, their surfaces covered in a slick, oily substance that ate through metal like acid. "You cannot escape," the creature said. "You are part of the delivery now. Your flesh will nourish the new growth." Jake felt something wrap around his ankle. He looked down to see a tendril snaking up his leg, its surface covered in tiny, tooth-like projections. The pain was immediate and intense, like being flayed alive. He could feel his blood being drawn into the thing, feeding it. With desperate strength, Jake kicked at the creature and managed to break free. He stumbled out of the cab and ran toward the tree line, but the tendrils followed. They moved across the ground like searching serpents, leaving trails of dead vegetation in their wake. Behind him, Jake could hear the creature's laughter, a sound like breaking branches and falling leaves. The entire highway was now covered in a writhing mass, and Jake realized with growing horror that this wasn't just about his cargo. This was an invasion. He reached the forest and kept running, branches tearing at his clothes and face. The tendrils followed him into the trees, and Jake watched in amazement as they began to merge with the root systems of the forest. The trees shuddered and changed, their bark becoming pale and smooth, their leaves withering and falling. Jake's CB radio crackled to life in his pocket. A voice he didn't recognize spoke through the static, "All units, all units. We have a biological contamination event on Interstate 80. The harvest protocol is in effect. Repeat, the harvest protocol is in effect." "Who is this?" Jake gasped into the radio. "Dr. Sarah Chen, CDC Emergency Response. Are you the driver of the contaminated vehicle?" "Yes." "What the hell is happening?" "The cargo you're carrying contains specimens of a parasitic organism we've been tracking for months. They're spreading faster than we anticipated. We need your exact location." Jake gave his coordinates while running deeper into the forest. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of the highway being consumed, the screech of metal being dissolved, the crack of asphalt splitting, the wet slapping of the tendrils as they spread. "The organism is called Vermis radix," Dr. Chen explained. "It's not from our world. It arrived in a meteorite that crashed in Siberia last year. The Russians tried to contain it, but some specimens were smuggled out." "How do I stop it?" Jake asked. "You can't," Dr. Chen replied grimly. "We're evacuating a 50-mile radius. The organism spreads through root systems and underground networks. Within days, it'll cover hundreds of square miles." Jake reached a clearing and turned to look back toward the highway. The entire forest was changing. The trees were becoming pale and twisted, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The sky above was darkening, not with clouds but with spores that drifted like black snow. "There's something else," Dr. Chen said. "The organism is intelligent. It learns from the hosts it consumes. If it reaches a major population center." The radio went dead. Jake was alone in the infected forest, surrounded by an alien ecosystem that was consuming everything in its path. He could hear the tendrils moving through the underground root systems, spreading their contamination with each passing moment. As Jake stumbled through the transforming wilderness, he realized the terrible truth. The man in the suit hadn't been human at all. He'd been one of them, using Jake to transport the specimens to a location where they could spread most effectively. The Colorado facility was probably just another collection point, another step in their plan to consume the continent. The last entry in Jake Morrison's logbook, found weeks later in his abandoned truck, read simply, "The cargo has been delivered. The harvest has begun. God help us all." But Jake Morrison was never found. Some say he's still out there, wandering the infected zones, transformed by the organism into something between human and plant. Others believe he was consumed entirely, his consciousness absorbed into the collective intelligence of the harvest. What is certain is that the contamination spread exactly as Dr. Chen predicted. Entire forests were consumed, their ecosystems replaced by something alien and hungry. The government tried to contain it with fire and chemicals, but the organism adapted faster than they could respond. Now, years later, truckers report seeing pale forests along certain stretches of highway, places where the trees move without wind and the very air seems to pulse with malevolent life. They speak of a figure that sometimes appears at truck stops, a tall, gaunt man who offers high-paying jobs to drivers willing to transport special cargo through the night. The smart ones say no. The desperate ones accept the job and are never seen again. But the cargo always reaches its destination, and the harvest continues to spread, one delivery at a time. Eddie Torino had been driving the same route for 15 years, Interstate 40 from Albuquerque to Oklahoma City. He knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every curve in the road. But on that fog-shrouded November night, Eddie discovered a stretch of highway that wasn't supposed to exist. The trouble started at the 247-mile marker, just outside Amarillo. Eddie was running behind schedule, pushing his rig through the Texas panhandle when the fog rolled in thick and fast. Visibility dropped to mere feet, forcing him to slow to a crawl. "Come on, Eddie," he muttered to himself, squinting through the windshield. "You've driven this road 1,000 times. But something was wrong. The mile markers weren't matching up with his GPS. According to his navigation system, he should have passed the 250 marker 10 minutes ago, but the last sign he'd seen was 247. The road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the gray void. Eddie's CB radio crackled to life. "Hey there, eastbound big truck. You got your ears on?" "Yeah, I'm here," Eddie replied, grateful for the contact. "This is Wild Card Eddie. This fog's got me turned around." "What's your 20? "Name's Phantom Mike," came the response. "I'm running about 2 miles ahead of you. Been driving this stretch for, well, seems like forever. Fair warning, partner, things get strange out here in the fog." Eddie frowned. He'd been driving this route for years and had never heard of any driver called Phantom Mike. "What kind of strange?" "You'll see," Mike's voice faded in and out through the static. "Just keep your eyes on the road and don't stop for anything. No matter what you see." The fog began to thin slightly, and Eddie caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. There, parked on the shoulder, was an overturned semi-truck. The cab was crushed, the trailer split open like a can opener had torn through it. But what made Eddie's hands shake wasn't the wreckage, it was the fact that he'd seen this exact accident before. 3 years ago, a driver named Tommy Castellano had jackknifed his rig on this very stretch of road. Eddie had been first on the scene, had pulled Tommy's broken body from the wreckage himself. The accident had happened at mile marker 249, but according to Eddie's instruments, he was still at 247. "Phantom Mike, you still there?" Eddie called into his CB. "Still here, wild card. You seeing things yet?" "There's a wreck on the shoulder." "Bad one. But it happened years ago." "Time's funny out here in the fog," Mike replied. "Past, present, future, it all runs together on the Phantom Mile." Eddie drove past the wreck, his headlights illuminating the twisted metal and scattered cargo. As he passed, he could swear he saw movement in the cab, a figure waving frantically for help. But when he looked in his mirrors, there was nothing but fog. The mile marker finally changed, 248. But Eddie's relief was short-lived. Ahead, his headlights picked up another semi-truck, this one driving slowly in the same direction. Eddie tried to pass, but every time he pulled into the left lane, the other truck would match his speed. "Hey, driver ahead of me," Eddie called on the CB. "You got a copy?" No response. Eddie flashed his high beams, but the other driver didn't react. As Eddie pulled alongside, he tried to get a look at the driver, but the cab windows were tinted too dark to see inside. That's when Eddie noticed the license plate. It was his own. The truck ahead was identical to his rig in every detail, same make, same model, same company logos. Even the mud patterns on the trailer were exactly the same. Eddie was following himself. "Phantom Mike," Eddie's voice cracked. "There's another truck ahead of me." It's my truck." "You're getting close now," Mike replied. "The Phantom Mile shows you things. Things that were, things that are, things that might be." The fog thickened again, and Eddie lost sight of the other truck. But now he could hear something else, the sound of multiple engines, dozens of them, all around him in the fog. The ghostly convoy of trucks that had become lost in the Phantom Mile. Eddie's instruments began to malfunction. His speedometer needle spun wildly, his fuel gauge fluctuated between empty and full, and his odometer was counting backward. The radio filled with voices, other drivers calling out positions, reporting breakdowns, asking for help. But their voices had a hollow, echoing quality, as if they were calling from the bottom of a well. "Breaker 19, this is Cowboy Jack. I've been stuck at mile marker 247 for 6 hours. Can't seem to get past it. This is Moondog Sally. My rig broke down at 248. Been waiting for a tow truck since Tuesday. What day is it now? Road Dog Bill here. I think I'm lost. Been driving the same stretch for. How long have I been driving?" Eddie realized with growing horror that these were the voices of drivers who had become trapped in the Phantom Mile. They were stuck in a loop, driving the same stretch of road over and over, unable to escape. "Phantom Mike," Eddie called desperately. "How do I get out of here?" "You don't," Mike replied sadly. "Nobody gets out of the Phantom Mile. We all just keep driving until we become part of it." The fog began to lift, and Eddie saw the truth. The highway stretched out ahead of him, but it wasn't the same road anymore. It was older, darker, made of stones instead of asphalt. Ancient mile markers bore symbols instead of numbers, and the shoulder was lined with the wreckage of vehicles from different eras, covered wagons, Model T Fords, motorcycles, and dozens of semi-trucks. Eddie was driving on the original road, the one that had existed before the interstate was built. All the vehicles that had ever been lost on this stretch of highway were here, trapped in an endless loop of travel with no destination. "Welcome to the Phantom Mile," Mike's voice said, and Eddie could see him now, a semi-truck from the 1970s, its paint faded and its chrome rusted. Behind the wheel sat a skeletal figure in a trucker's cap, his eye sockets glowing with a dim, phosphorescent light. "I've been driving this road since 1974, Mike continued. Broke down here during a blizzard. froze to death in my cab. But I kept driving anyway. We all did. Eddie tried to turn around, but the road wouldn't let him. It stretched out ahead and behind in an impossible loop, defying the laws of physics and geography. He was trapped in a pocket dimension, a piece of highway that existed between the real world and somewhere else. Why? Eddie asked. Why does this place exist? Every road has a hunger, Mike explained. The Phantom Mile is where that hunger lives. It feeds on travelers, on their stories, on their need to keep moving. We're all part of the road now, Eddie. We're all just cargo being transported to nowhere. Eddie's truck began to change. The paint faded, the chrome dulled, and the engine sound became hollow and distant. He could feel himself changing too, his flesh becoming cold and rigid, his eyes growing dim. Don't fight it, Mike advised. It's not so bad once you accept it. We're all brothers of the road here. We look out for each other. But Eddie wasn't ready to give up. He remembered his wife, his kids, his life beyond the highway. He floored the accelerator, pushing his rig to its limit. The speedometer needle climbed past 100, past 150, past speeds that should have been impossible. The Phantom Mile fought back. The road ahead began to crack and buckle, trying to prevent his escape. The other trucks moved to block his path, their ghostly drivers honking their horns in protest. But Eddie kept driving, his determination fueled by memories of home. You can't leave. Mike shouted over the CB. Nobody leaves the Phantom Mile. Eddie saw it ahead, a crack in the fog, a glimpse of normal highway beyond. He aimed for it, his truck shuddering as it crossed the boundary between the Phantom Mile and the real world. There was a moment of intense disorientation, as if he was being pulled through a narrow tunnel, and then he was back on Interstate 40, mile marker 248. The fog was lifting, revealing the familiar landscape of the Texas Panhandle. Eddie's instruments were working normally, showing the correct time and distance. It was as if the Phantom Mile had never existed. But when Eddie looked in his mirrors, he could see the fog still swirling behind him, and occasionally, just for a moment, he could glimpse the headlights of other trucks moving through the gray void. The Phantom Mile was still there, still hungry, still waiting for the next driver to become lost in its endless loop. Eddie drove straight through to Oklahoma City without stopping. He filed a report about the incident, but his company dismissed it as fatigue-induced hallucinations. The official records showed no unusual weather conditions, no reported accidents, no driver named Phantom Mike. But Eddie knew the truth. The Phantom Mile was real, and it was still out there, feeding on lost travelers. He changed his route after that, taking the longer path through Colorado rather than risk encountering it again. Other drivers began to report similar experiences. Stories of a stretch of highway that didn't match the maps, of fog that came from nowhere, of ghostly convoys trapped in an endless journey. The trucking community whispered about the Phantom Mile, warning each other to stay alert during night runs through the Texas Panhandle. Some drivers claimed to have seen Eddie's truck in the fog, leading other vehicles to safety. They called him the guardian of the Phantom Mile, a driver who had escaped the trap and now helped others do the same. But Eddie knew better. He hadn't escaped entirely. Part of him was still there, still driving that impossible road. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would hear Phantom Mike's voice on his CB radio, calling out position reports from the void. "This is Phantom Mike to Wild Card Eddie. You got your ears on, partner. We're still here, still driving. The Phantom Mile remembers you. It's waiting for you to come back." Eddie would turn off his radio and keep driving, but he knew the truth. The Phantom Mile never let go of its travelers completely. It would always be there, just beyond the fog, waiting for him to take one wrong turn and find himself back on that endless stretch of haunted highway. The road never forgets, and neither do the drivers who become part of it. In the Phantom Mile, every journey is the same journey, and every destination is nowhere at all. The track stretched endlessly into the Montana wilderness, two parallel lines of steel that had carried freight and dreams across the continent for over a century. I'd been working the night shift as a track inspector for Northern Pacific Railways for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the rails could throw at me. Derailments, equipment failures, even the occasional suicide. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what I encountered on mile marker 347. It started with a routine maintenance call on October 13, 2019. The automated monitoring system had detected an anomaly in the track alignment somewhere between Whitefish and Glacier Park. My supervisor, Bill Henderson, handed me the work order with his usual gruff efficiency. "Probably just thermal expansion," he said, not looking up from his paperwork. "Take the high rail truck and check it out. Should be straightforward." I loaded my equipment into the modified pickup truck that could run on both roads and railways, and headed out into the crisp autumn evening. The sun was setting behind the Rockies, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. It was beautiful, peaceful, the kind of night that made you forget why city folks thought the wilderness was scary. The high rail truck hummed along the tracks, its specialized wheels following the steel rails with mechanical precision. I'd made this journey countless times, but something felt different that night. The usual sounds of the forest, owls hooting, branches rustling, the distant call of coyotes, were absent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Mile marker 346 passed by my headlights. Then 347 appeared ahead, and I slowed the truck to a crawl. According to the GPS, the anomaly should be right around here. I stopped the truck and climbed out, pulling my heavy-duty flashlight from the toolbox. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rails that stretched ahead like a silver highway to nowhere. At first glance, everything looked normal. The rails were properly aligned, the railroad ties appeared solid, and the ballast stones were evenly distributed. But as I walked along the track, my light caught something that made my blood run cold. About 50 feet ahead, the rails simply ended. Not broken, not torn up, but cleanly cut, as if someone had taken a massive saw and severed them with surgical precision. Beyond the cut, there was nothing but empty air stretching across a chasm that definitely hadn't been there on any of my previous inspections. I radioed back to dispatch immediately. "Base, this is Chen. I've got a major problem at mile 347. The tracks are completely severed. There's a gorge here that's not on any of our maps." Static crackled through the radio for a long moment before Bill's voice came through, distorted and faint. "Say again, Chen. Did you say severed?" "That's affirmative. Clean cut, both rails. And there's a canyon here that goes down. God, I can't even see the bottom." "That's impossible. There's no canyon on that route. Are you sure you're at the right marker?" I looked back at the mile marker, clearly visible in my truck's headlights. "Mile 347, just like the work order says." "Chen, I'm looking at the geological survey right now. That's flat prairie land for the next 20 miles. There's no canyon anywhere in that area." I walked to the edge of the severed tracks and shone my flashlight down into the abyss. The beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, unable to penetrate whatever lay below. A cold wind rose from the depths, carrying with it a smell that made my stomach turn, something like rotting meat mixed with sulfur. "Bill, I'm telling you what I'm seeing. The tracks end here, and there's a massive drop-off. I can't see the bottom. Stay put. I'm sending a crew out to your location." I returned to my truck, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness beyond the severed rails. Every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned my flashlight toward it, there was nothing there. 20 minutes later, I saw headlights approaching along the tracks. Bill's truck pulled up beside mine, followed by a second vehicle carrying two other maintenance workers, Rodriguez and Patterson. They climbed out, their faces skeptical but concerned. "All right, Chen," Bill said, grabbing his own flashlight. "Show me this canyon." I led them to the spot where the tracks ended, but as we approached, my heart nearly stopped. The rails continued unbroken into the distance. The canyon was gone. "Jesus, Marcus," Rodriguez muttered. "What the hell are you trying to pull?" "I swear to God, the tracks were cut right here," I said, my voice shaking. There was a canyon, deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom. Bill knelt down and examined the rails where I'd claimed they were severed. His flashlight revealed continuous, unbroken steel. "Marcus, these rails are solid. There's no sign of any damage, no tool marks, nothing." "That's impossible. I was just here." "Look, son," Bill interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "When's the last time you had a full medical checkup? Sometimes the mind plays tricks, especially working nights out here alone." I wanted to argue, but the evidence was right there. The tracks were whole, the land was flat, and there was no sign of the abyss I'd seen just minutes before. But I knew what I'd witnessed. The clean cut in the rails, the yawning darkness, the putrid smell rising from below, it had all been real. "Check the automated monitoring logs," I said desperately. "The system detected an anomaly. That's why I'm here." Bill pulled out his tablet and scrolled through the data. His frown deepened as he read. "Marcus, there's no anomaly logged for mile 347. The system shows all green for this entire section." "That's not possible. You handed me the work order yourself." "What work order?" I reached into my pocket for the paperwork, but my hand closed on empty air. The work order was gone. Patterson, who had been examining the tracks further ahead, called back to us. "Hey, Bill. You need to see this." We followed him about 100 feet down the line, where his flashlight illuminated something that made us all freeze. There, embedded in the wooden railroad tie, was a metal plate that read, "Mile marker 347, last mile, established 1887. "What the hell does last mile mean?" Rodriguez whispered. Bill's face had gone pale. "I've never seen a marker like this before. And 1887. That's 20 years before this section of track was even built." I knelt down and brushed away the dirt and debris around the marker. Underneath, carved into the wood of the tie itself, were dozens of names and dates. The carving was crude, as if done with a knife or piece of metal, and the dates ranged from 1887 to yesterday. "These are all railroad workers," I said, recognizing some of the names from old company records. "But look at the dates. Some of these men died decades ago, but their dates are listed as recent. The most recent entry made my blood freeze, Marcus Chen, October 13, 2019. "That's today," Patterson said unnecessarily. "That's your name, Marcus." We all stared at the carving in silence. The letters were fresh, the wood around them still showing the pale color of a recent cut. "Someone's playing a sick joke," Bill said, but his voice lacked conviction. As he spoke, the radio in his truck crackled to life. The voice that came through was mine, but I wasn't speaking. "Base, this is Chen. I've got a major problem at mile 347. It was the exact conversation I'd had with Bill 20 minutes earlier, playing back word for word. We all turned to look at the radio, and as we did, we heard my truck's engine start up behind us. I spun around to see my high-rail truck pulling away from us, moving slowly down the tracks. Through the rear window, I could see the silhouette of a figure in the driver's seat, but it was too dark to make out any details. "Hey!" I shouted, running after the truck. "Stop!" But the vehicle continued moving, picking up speed as it headed toward what I knew had to be the severed tracks and the abyss beyond, even though I couldn't see them anymore. "Marcus, wait!" Bill called, but I was already running, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I chased after my own truck. The distance between us grew rapidly. The truck was moving faster than any human could run, and I watched helplessly as it approached the point where I knew the tracks ended. I expected to see it plunge into the canyon I'd witnessed earlier, but instead, it simply vanished. One moment the taillights were visible in the distance, the next they were gone, as if the truck had driven into a wall of absolute darkness. I stopped running, gasping for breath in the thin mountain air. Behind me, I could hear Bill and the others calling my name, but their voices seemed distant, muffled. When I turned around, I couldn't see their flashlights anymore. The silence that followed was complete. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic, just the kind of absolute quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. And then, from somewhere ahead in the darkness, I heard the sound of my own voice again. "Base, this is Chen. I've got a major problem at mile 347. I followed the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the night. The rails stretched ahead of me, but something was wrong with them now. They seemed to shimmer and bend, as if they were made of liquid mercury instead of steel. With each step, the voice grew clearer, and I realized it was coming from below. Looking down between the railroad ties, I saw lights moving in the darkness beneath the track bed. Not the steady glow of electric lights, but flickering, dancing illumination like torches or lanterns. And with the lights came voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once, all repeating the same radio calls I'd heard throughout my career. Track obstruction at mile 12. Signal failure at junction 7. Derailment, all units respond. The voices were those of railroad workers, but they were wrong somehow. Too mechanical, too precise, as if someone was playing recordings of long-dead men. I realized then that I was standing exactly where the tracks had been severed earlier. The rails beneath my feet were solid, but I could see through them now, down into a vast underground chamber filled with moving lights and shadows. And there, in the center of it all, was my high-rail truck, parked among dozens of other vehicles from different eras. Steam locomotives, handcars, modern maintenance trucks, all arranged in neat rows like cars in a parking lot. Figures moved between the vehicles, and as my eyes adjusted to the strange flickering light, I could make out their shapes. They were railroad workers, all right, but they moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like marionettes controlled by an inexpert puppeteer. Their faces were pale and slack, their eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. One of them looked up at me. It was Rodriguez, but not the Rodriguez I'd seen just minutes before. This version was somehow wrong. His uniform was clean and pressed, his face was expressionless, and when he raised his hand to wave, the gesture was too slow, too deliberate. "Come down, Marcus," he called, his voice carrying perfectly through the air despite the distance. "Your shift is starting." I backed away from the edge, but as I did, I felt the rails beneath my feet beginning to soften and bend. The solid steel was becoming liquid, and I was sinking into it like quicksand. "Base, this is Chen," I heard myself saying, though I hadn't keyed the radio. "I've got a major problem at mile 347. The words came from my own mouth, but I wasn't choosing to speak them. It was as if someone else was controlling my voice, making me repeat the same transmission over and over again. As I sank deeper into the liquefying rails, I saw more figures emerging from the underground chamber. They were all railroad workers from different eras, their uniforms spanning decades of company history. Some wore the heavy wool of early steam-era workers, others the polyester of the 1970s, and a few were dressed in modern high-visibility safety gear. They were all walking toward me with that same mechanical gait, and as they got closer, I could see their faces more clearly. They were the names from the marker, workers who had died on the job, some in accidents, others from old age years after retirement. But here they were, still working, still making their rounds along tracks that existed in some impossible space between the real world and whatever lay beneath. "Your shift is starting," they said in unison, their voices creating a hollow echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Your shift is starting." I was waist-deep in the rails now, the metal flowing around me like thick liquid. But instead of being crushed or burned, I felt strangely comfortable, as if I was settling into a warm bath. The panic I'd felt moments before was fading, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. Of course my shift was starting. I was a railroad man, and railroad men worked the night shift. They kept the trains running, maintained the tracks, and made sure the cargo got through. It was important work, essential work, and it never stopped. Base, this is Chen. I've got a major problem at mile 347. I understood now why I kept repeating the same transmission. It wasn't a malfunction or a recording, it was a warning. Mile 347 was the last mile, the end of the line, the place where railroad workers came when their earthly shifts were over. And my job was to guide others to the same understanding. The rails had closed over my head now, but I could still see and breathe. I was part of the track itself, embedded in the infrastructure I'd spent my life maintaining. And from this new vantage point, I could see the truth of mile 347. The tracks didn't end here, they began here. This was the starting point for a railway that stretched through dimensions I couldn't fully comprehend, carrying cargo between worlds that existed in the spaces between reality. And every railroad worker who had ever lived, every man and woman who had dedicated their life to keeping the trains running, eventually found their way here to continue their work. Above me, I could hear Bill's voice calling my name, but it sounded distant and unimportant. He would file a report, search parties would be organized, and eventually, I would be declared missing. But I wasn't missing, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The other workers helped me to my feet, and I found myself standing in the underground chamber, dressed in a clean uniform that fit perfectly. My high-rail truck was waiting for me, keys in the ignition, ready for another night of track inspection. "Welcome to the last mile," Rodriguez said, and this time his smile seemed genuine. "We've been waiting for you." I climbed into my truck and started the engine. There was work to be done, tracks to inspect, and new workers to guide to their final shift. Through the windshield, I could see the rails stretching ahead into an impossible distance, lit by the same flickering lights that had guided me here. And somewhere above, in the world I'd left behind, the monitoring system would detect another anomaly at mile 347. Another worker would be dispatched to investigate, and the cycle would continue. "Base, this is Chen," I said into the radio, my voice clear and strong. "I've got a major problem at mile 347. But it wasn't a problem anymore. It was just the beginning of the longest shift of my life. Marcus Chen was declared missing on October 14, 2019, after failing to return from a routine track inspection. His vehicle was never found, and no trace of him has been discovered despite extensive search efforts. The monitoring system continues to report periodic anomalies at mile 347, but all subsequent inspections have found the tracks to be in perfect condition. The Interstate Railroad Commission has classified this case as unsolved. This account was compiled from security footage, radio transmissions, and testimony from the 3 other railroad workers who responded to Chen's location that night. All 3 men have since requested transfers to different sections of the railway, and none have been willing to work the night shift since the incident. October 28, 2018. Started my first shift at Signal Tower 19 today. It's a lonely posting, 40 miles outside of Birmingham, Alabama, controlling the switches and signals for a busy freight junction. The tower sits about 50 feet above the tracks, giving me a clear view of the 5 different rail lines that converge here. My supervisor, Janet Walsh, gave me the basic rundown. Monitor the automated systems, manually override when necessary, and always, maintain visual contact with any train passing through. She mentioned that Tower 19 has had some staffing issues lately, but wouldn't elaborate. The pay is 30% above standard rate, which should have been my first warning. The tower itself is old, built in the 1940s, but the equipment has been updated over the years. Banks of monitors show train positions, radio equipment keeps me in contact with dispatch, and the manual controls can override any automated system if needed. It's straightforward work, just lonely. During my 12-hour shift, I handled 43 trains without incident. The night was clear, and I could see the headlights approaching from miles away. Everything seemed normal until around 3 a.m., when I noticed something odd. A freight train was approaching from the northeast line, a standard consists of about 30 cars. But as it got closer, I realized I couldn't see the locomotive's headlight. The train was moving at normal speed, making normal sounds, but there was no light at the front. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the approaching train. What I saw made me drop them in shock. There was no locomotive. The first car, a grain hopper, was somehow pulling itself along the tracks, followed by the rest of the consist. But that was impossible, trains don't move without engines. I checked the computer system, and it showed a normal freight train with locomotive number 4419. The automated systems were tracking it properly, the signals were changing as they should, and everything appeared normal on the monitors. But looking out the window, I could see a headless train rolling through the junction, its wheels clicking rhythmically on the rails, its cars swaying slightly as they navigated the curves. The whole consist passed through without incident, disappearing into the darkness toward Memphis. I called dispatch immediately. Dispatch, this is Tower 19. I need to report an anomaly with eastbound freight 0328. Go ahead, Tower 19. The train appears to be missing its locomotive. I'm showing 30 cars with no engine. There was a pause. Tower 19, our systems show locomotive 4419 pulling 30 cars on eastbound freight 0328. All readings are normal. Dispatch, I'm telling you there's no locomotive. The first car is a grain hopper, and it's somehow moving under its own power. Another pause, longer this time. Tower 19, are you feeling alright? Do you need medical assistance? I looked out the window again, but the train was gone. The tracks were empty, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the tower's metal framework. Never mind, dispatch. Must have been a trick of the light. Copy that, Tower 19. Remember, if you're feeling unwell, we can send a relief operator. I spent the rest of my shift staring out the window, but nothing else unusual happened. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that headless train rolling through the junction like some kind of ghost. October 29, 2018. Second night at Tower 19. I arrived early to check the equipment, thinking maybe there was a malfunction that caused last night's hallucination. Everything tested normal. The shift started routinely. Freight trains, passenger services, and the occasional maintenance vehicle. I was beginning to think last night had been stress or fatigue playing tricks on my mind. Then, around 2:30 a.m., I heard it. A train whistle, long and mournful, echoing across the empty Alabama countryside. But it wasn't coming from any of the 5 rail lines that converge at the junction. The sound seemed to originate from directly below the tower. I looked down at the tracks, but they were empty. The whistle sounded again, closer this time, and I realized it was coming from underneath the rails themselves. As if there were tunnels down there, which there weren't. I grabbed my flashlight and went out onto the tower's observation deck. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the steel rails and wooden ties. Everything looked normal, but the whistle continued, growing louder and more insistent. Then I saw movement in the shadows between the tracks. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a dog. But as I focused the light, I saw it was a man in a railroad uniform, walking along the tracks with a lantern in his hand. "Hey!" I called out. "You can't be down there. There's a train coming." The figure looked up at me, and I nearly dropped my flashlight. His face was pale and gaunt, with dark circles around his eyes. When he opened his mouth to speak, no sound came out, but I could see him mouthing words. "Help me," he seemed to be saying. "Help me find the train." I checked the monitors. There was indeed a freight train approaching from the south, about 10 minutes out. The man was standing directly in its path. "Move!" I shouted. "Get off the tracks." But the figure just stood there, lantern swaying in his hand, looking up at me with those hollow eyes. And then, as I watched, he began to fade, becoming translucent like morning mist. Within seconds, he was gone. The freight train arrived on schedule, its headlight cutting through the darkness where the man had been standing. It passed through the junction without incident, but as it did, I could swear I heard that same mournful whistle mixed in with the normal sounds of the locomotive. I called dispatch again, but this time I didn't mention what I'd seen. Instead, I reported a possible trespasser and requested additional security patrols. They said they'd look into it. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man with the lantern. There was something familiar about his uniform, something that reminded me of pictures I'd seen of railroad workers from decades past. October 30th, 2018. Third night. I did some research during the day and found something disturbing. In 1962, a signal tower operator named James Whitmore disappeared from Tower 19 during his night shift. His body was never found, but his lantern was discovered on the tracks the next morning, crushed by a passing freight train. According to the newspaper reports, Whitmore had been acting strangely in the weeks before his disappearance, claiming to see phantom trains and reporting anomalies that the automated systems couldn't detect. His co-workers thought he was having a nervous breakdown. The description of Whitmore in the newspaper matched the man I'd seen with the lantern. I arrived at the tower determined to stay focused on my job and ignore any hallucinations. But as the night wore on, I found myself constantly checking the tracks below, looking for any sign of the ghostly figure. Around 1 a.m., the radio crackled to life with a transmission that made my blood run cold. Tower 19, this is engine 4419. Do you copy? I checked the monitors. There was no train designated 4419 on any of the approaches. According to the system, the tracks were clear for the next hour. Unknown caller, this is Tower 19. Please identify yourself and your location. Tower 19, engine 4419 requesting permission to proceed through the junction. We're carrying 30 cars of grain, eastbound to Memphis. It was the same train I'd seen 2 nights ago, the headless freight that had somehow moved without a locomotive. But now it was talking to me. Engine 4419, I show no train at your designated number. Please confirm your location. Tower 19, we're about 2 miles out on the northeast approach. Can you see our headlight? I looked toward the northeast line. The tracks were empty, but as I watched, a dim light appeared in the distance. It was barely visible, more like a candle flame than a locomotive headlight, but it was definitely there. Engine 4419, I can see your light, but it's very faint. Are you experiencing electrical problems? Negative, Tower 19. All systems are functioning normally. We should be coming into view any moment now. The light grew brighter as it approached, but something was wrong with it. Instead of the steady white beam of a modern locomotive, this light flickered and danced like an old oil lamp. And as it got closer, I could see that it wasn't attached to a train at all. The man with the lantern was walking along the tracks, holding his light high above his head. Behind him, barely visible in the darkness, I could make out the shapes of railroad cars following along like obedient animals. Engine 4419, I need you to stop immediately. There's a problem with the junction. Tower 19, we can't stop. We're already late, and the cargo needs to reach Memphis by morning. The ghostly train was approaching the junction now, and I could see it more clearly. The cars were old, much older than anything currently in service. They looked like they belonged to the 1960s, with faded paint and rust streaks along their sides. Engine 4419, you are not authorized to proceed. Stop your train immediately. Tower 19, with respect, we have authorization from Central Dispatch. We're coming through. I frantically checked the computer system, looking for any record of this train, but found nothing. According to every monitor and sensor, the tracks were completely empty. Yet I could see the phantom consist approaching the junction, led by the ghostly figure of James Whitmore. Engine 4419, if you proceed through the junction, you'll collide with eastbound freight 0445. There was no eastbound freight 0445. I was lying, hoping to stop the phantom train. But as soon as I said it, the monitors lit up with alerts. A train had suddenly appeared on the system, eastbound freight 0445, approaching from the south. Tower 19, we don't see any other traffic. Our route is clear. Through the southern window, I could see real headlights approaching. A genuine freight train was coming toward the junction, and according to the timing, it would arrive at exactly the same moment as the phantom train. I grabbed the manual controls and tried to switch the phantom train to a different track, but the system wouldn't respond. The computer insisted that there was no train to divert. Engine 4419, you need to take the northern bypass. Switch to track 3 immediately. Tower 19, we can't see track 3. Our route only shows the main line. The two trains were converging on the junction, one real and one impossible. I could see the genuine freight train clearly now, locomotive 2847 pulling a long string of container cars. The engineer had no idea what was about to happen. Engine 2847, this is Tower 19. You need to stop immediately. There's traffic in the junction. Tower 19, this is 2847. I don't see any traffic. My route is clear. The phantom train reached the junction first, and I watched in horror as James Whitmore stepped onto the main line, his lantern held high. Behind him, the ghostly cars began to cross the intersection, their wheels making no sound on the steel rails. Engine 2847 was less than 100 yards away now, its headlight illuminating the junction. But somehow, the engineer couldn't see the phantom train crossing directly in front of him. Engine 2847, stop. There's a train in the junction. Tower 19, negative. I have a clear route. The collision should have been catastrophic. Tons of steel and cargo meeting at 40 miles per hour, cars derailing, cargo spilling, possibly lives lost. But as the real locomotive reached the junction, something impossible happened. The phantom train simply wasn't there anymore. Engine 2847 passed through the intersection without incident, its headlight cutting through empty air where the ghostly consist had been just moments before. I slumped back in my chair, shaking. The radio crackled one more time. Tower 19, this is Engine 4419. Thanks for the assistance. We're clear of the junction and proceeding to Memphis. But there was no Engine 4419. There never had been. Just the ghost of a train that had derailed in 1962, killing its entire crew, including the engineer who had been trying to contact Tower 19 for help when it happened. I found the accident report in the archives the next morning. A freight train carrying grain to Memphis had derailed at the junction on October 30, 1962, due to a signal malfunction. The locomotive and first 3 cars had plunged into a ravine, and the crew's bodies were never recovered. The engineer's name was Michael Torres. His last radio transmission was to Tower 19, requesting permission to proceed through the junction. October 31, 2018. Halloween night. I almost called in sick, but I needed this job. The pay was good, and despite everything I'd experienced, I was beginning to understand why Tower 19 had staffing problems. I arrived at sunset to find a note taped to the door, "Tommy, good luck tonight. Remember, they're just looking for help getting home. J.W." The handwriting was old-fashioned, the kind you'd learn in school decades ago. And the initials. J.W. James Whitmore, the signal operator who disappeared in 1962. I climbed the stairs to the control room, my hands shaking as I turned on the equipment. Everything looked normal, but I could feel a presence in the tower with me, as if I wasn't alone. The first few hours passed quietly. I handled normal traffic, coordinated with dispatch, and tried to ignore the growing sense that something was building toward a climax. At 11:47 p.m., all the monitors went dead simultaneously. The radio fell silent, the lights flickered, and the automated system stopped responding. I was alone in the tower with nothing but the manual controls and my own eyes. Then I heard them, multiple train whistles, all blowing at once, from every direction. Not the sharp blast of modern air horns, but the deep, mournful wail of old steam engines. I looked out the windows and saw lights approaching from all 5 rail lines. Not the bright white beams of modern locomotives, but the warm yellow glow of oil lamps and gas lanterns. The phantom trains were coming from every direction, converging on the junction like iron rivers flowing toward a steel sea. The radio crackled back to life, and I heard voices, dozens of them, all trying to communicate at once. Tower 19, this is engine 4419, requesting permission to proceed. Tower 19, this is engine 1887, we're running behind schedule. Tower 19, this is engine 2634, we need to switch to the northern line. Tower 19, this is engine 3451, our signal light is malfunctioning. They were all phantom trains, ghost consists carrying the spirits of railroad workers who had died in accidents over the decades. And they were all looking to me for guidance, for permission to complete their final runs. I grabbed the manual controls and began directing traffic, switching trains from track to track, coordinating their movements through the junction. It was like conducting an orchestra of the dead, each phantom train waiting for my signal before proceeding. Engine 4419, you're clear for the main line. Proceed to Memphis. Engine 1887, take the northern bypass. Watch for eastbound traffic. Engine 2634, hold at the signal. I'll clear the junction in 2 minutes. One by one, the phantom trains passed through the junction, their ghostly crews waving from the cab windows as they disappeared into the darkness. I could see James Whitmore among them, no longer walking with his lantern but riding in the cab of engine 4419, finally reunited with his train. The last ghost train passed through at exactly midnight, and suddenly all the lights and monitors came back online. The radio resumed its normal chatter, and the automated systems began functioning again. But I was no longer alone in the tower. Standing behind me was a figure in a modern railroad uniform, myself, but older, more weathered, with the same hollow eyes I'd seen in James Whitmore. Your shift is over, he said in my own voice. I'll take it from here. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were becoming translucent, fading like morning mist. Below me, I could see my own body slumped over the control panel, and I realized with growing horror that I had become part of Tower 19's eternal staff. Don't worry, the other me said. It's not so bad. You'll learn to help them find their way home. As I faded completely, I heard one last transmission on the radio, Tower 19, this is engine 4419. Thanks for the assistance. We're clear of the junction and proceeding to Memphis. But the voice wasn't Michael Torres anymore. It was mine. November 1st, 2018. This entry was written in different handwriting. Started my first shift at Tower 19 today. It's a lonely posting, 40 miles outside of Birmingham, Alabama, controlling the switches and signals for a busy freight junction. The tower sits about 50 feet above the tracks, giving me a clear view of the 5 different rail lines that converge here. My supervisor, Janet Walsh, gave me the basic rundown. Monitor the automated systems, manually override when necessary, and always, maintain visual contact with any train passing through. She mentioned that Tower 19 has had some staffing issues lately, but wouldn't elaborate. The pay is 30% above standard rate, which should have been my first warning. Found a note in the control room, welcome to Tower 19. The night shift can be challenging, but remember, you're helping them get home. TM. I wonder what that means. Thomas Mitchell's body was discovered in Tower 19 on November 1, 2018, at the start of the day shift. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though he was only 34 years old with no history of cardiac problems. His replacement, David Chen, reported several unusual incidents during his first week but was dismissed from the position after claiming to see phantom trains and reporting system anomalies that couldn't be verified. Tower 19 has been automated since December 2018. The Central Southern Railway reports that the automated systems function normally, though there have been occasional unexplained radio transmissions from the tower's frequency. These transmissions appear to be routine traffic coordination, but they reference train numbers that don't exist in the current system. Local railroad workers have reported seeing lights in the tower windows during night shifts, despite the fact that the facility is unmanned. When investigated, these reports have invariably been attributed to reflections or atmospheric phenomena. The tower remains operational, though the railway has discontinued plans to resume human staffing at the facility.